Okay, imagine this for a second. It's March 2020. The world is basically shutting down, right? Global pandemic starting to hit.
Yeah, a really unsettling time.
Exactly. And you've got the spy chief, Israel's Mossad head, working secure phones from his house, probably hasn't slept much.
Right.
And apparently his white poodle is just barking its head off in the background, like total domestic
A
chaos.
very relatable detail, actually.
But his mission, he's trying to get 10 million surgical masks from a country Israel doesn't even have normal relations with. And this whole chaotic scene turns out to be like the first tiny thread in this massive historic diplomatic shift.
That's a perfect starting point, because that's what we're digging into today, the really complex, often hidden story behind the Abraham Accords.
Yeah.
For so long, the Middle East narrative was just conflict, conflict, conflict. These agreements were, well, genuinely seismic, normalization between Israel and several Arab nations.
So our mission here is to really get behind those headlines. We want to show you the intricate dance, the secret meetings, the big political bets, and some honestly surprising things that push these accords forward.
We'll look at who the key players were, what was really driving them, and how events that seemed totally unconnected, like, a pandemic and a barking dog, actually helped pave the way.
So by the end, you won't just know what happened, but really how and why it all came together. We got some great details that bring it all to life.
Okay, so let's pick up with that first public hint. June 25th, 2020. Benjamin Netanyahu makes this announcement. Seems pretty straightforward. Israel and the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, they're going to cooperate on COVID-19 stuff. Medical supplies, know-how.
Which, I mean, even that was pretty stunning, right? Given they had zero formal diplomatic ties, Netanyahu himself kind of flagged it, saying it opened up possibilities for open cooperation they hadn't seen before. How big a deal did that feel like at the time?
Oh, it was huge. Really surprising, because the context was so tricky.
Yeah.
The UAE, well, they were much more careful about it. Their statements were really low-key, stressing it was just private companies involved, not the governments themselves.
Why so cautious?
Well, there's always this fear, in the Arab world about public backlash over any dealings with Israel. And this was especially sensitive because at that exact moment, Netanyahu's government was seriously talking about annexing parts of the West Bank.
Ah, right. Bad timing.
Terrible timing.
Yeah.
Any public link-up with Israel could look like they were basically okaying the annexation plan.
Okay, so enter the spy chief we mentioned. Yossi Cohen, head of Mossad back then. He's the one making calls from home back in March, getting those 10 million masks from the UAE. The deal was masks for Israeli medical expertise and, interestingly, security help, too.
Yeah.
But why Mossad? I mean, wouldn't that usually be like the health ministry or the foreign ministry's job?
That's a really good question, and it's key. Mossad could operate in places where Israel didn't have normal diplomatic channels. That's part one. But part two, and this is crucial, they were actively using this coronavirus diplomacy, as it got called, as a lever, a way to spark bigger diplomatic breakthroughs.
So it wasn't just about the masks.
Not at all. It was strategic. It was about using the crisis to test the waters, build some quiet trust. Cohen was juggling it all, giving orders to agents, talking to top Emirati officials, while, his wife Aya apparently had to deal with the poodle. It's quite the image.
So this medical cooperation, it starts quiet, mainly to keep the UAE comfortable, but it's definitely breaking new ground. Cohen wanted it public, but he got that a crisis lets you make bold moves, maybe quietly at first.
Right. And he was so involved, he actually wrote Netanyahu's speech for that June announcement. He negotiated the exact words, the timing with the Emiratis. He knew they were worried about the potential fallout.
And it paid off, didn't it, in the bigger picture?
Massively. Cohen apparently told colleagues later that the full normalization deal, the one announced just 2 months after that speech, might never have happened without those initial steps. Building that trust over masks and medical tech.
Wow. So a surgical mask becomes like a building block for peace. Amazing.
It really shows how sometimes small, quiet steps can lead to huge shifts.
Okay, so trust is starting to build quietly, but there was this massive storm cloud looming, wasn't there? Something that could have just blown the whole thing up.
Absolutely. And that was the annexation plan. Netanyahu had been promising this for a while. It was a big part of his 2019 election campaign, annexing Jewish settlements in the West Bank, the Jordan Valley, land occupied since '67.
And didn't President Trump's peace plan, the Peace to Prosperity thing from January 2020, kind of give that a green light?
It sort of did, yeah. The plan basically said the U.S. would recognize annexation if Israel agreed to it in return for a potential Palestinian state on about 70% of the West Bank, plus some special stuff for Jerusalem. So it looked like American backing.
But it wasn't that simple, was it? There was pushback.
Oh, huge pushback. Fierce opposition. You had European countries. The U.K. was quite vocal condemning it. King Abdullah of Jordan warned it could cause massive conflict and even threaten his own peace treaty with Israel, which is strategically vital for Israel.
And not just from outside Israel.
Right. Even inside Netanyahu's own coalition government. Benny Gantz's party, Blue and White, they were against it. And maybe surprisingly, some of the settlers themselves or their leaders opposed the Trump plan part of it.
Why? You'd think they'd be for annexation.
Because they feared the flip side that the plan also talked about a Palestinian state. People like Bezalel Smotrich, a far-right figure, basically said, look, it's either a future for the settlements or a Palestinian state. You can't have both.
So a really tangled mess of opposition. What was the U.S. really thinking? Were they fully behind Netanyahu on this?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. Publicly, maybe it looked like a green light. But behind the scenes, U.S. officials like Ambassador David Friedman and Jared Kushner were pretty clear. U.S. recognition of annexation depended on Israel agreeing to negotiate with the Palestinians based on Trump's plan.
So conditions attached.
Big conditions. Kushner even said later they considered not using their UN veto if Israel went ahead unilaterally with annexation and faced international sanctions. That's a pretty strong signal from Washington.
Okay, but then came the UAE intervention. Yusuf al-Otaiba, their ambassador in Washington. You're saying he was maybe the most crucial voice against annexation?
Arguably, yes.
Yeah.
He told the American peace team, Kushner, Berkowitz, look, annexing the West Bank is really dangerous. It will kill the prospect of normalization. Coming from the UAE, a key potential partner that carried enormous weight.
And Otaiba was particularly well-placed to deliver that message.
Definitely. He'd been ambassador in D.C. for 12 years, American-educated, really understood how Washington worked, its DNA and rhythms, as one source put it. And crucially, he was very, very close to the Crown Prince, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed MBZ. He spoke with real authority.
It wasn't entirely out of the blue, though. There had been little signs of warming ties before this, right? Secret meetings going back years.
Yeah, absolutely. Contacts since at least 2008. There was a story about Netanyahu meeting MBZ's brother in a hotel room back in 2012 to talk about Iran. And more publicly, remember that dinner in late 2018, Otaiba sitting down for a kosher meal with Ron Dermer, Israel's ambassador to the U.S. That raised eyebrows?
But Otaiba's next move was even bolder, wasn't it? The op-ed.
That was the big one. He reached out to Haim Sabin, the media mogul, and arranged to publish an opinion piece in Yediot Ahronoth, a huge newspaper in Israel, basically talking directly to the Israeli public.
What was the message?
It was pretty direct.
Yeah.
Spread right across the front page. The headline essentially said, annexation and normalization just don't go together. A contradiction. That was the warning, the stick. But he also offered a carrot, hinting at closer security cooperation, working together against shared threats.
And how did it land?
It ended with this line. In the UAE and across much of the Arab world, we would like to believe Israel is an opportunity, not an enemy. It was effectively opening a door, saying there's another path here if you choose not to annex.
So, faced with all this opposition, especially Otaiba's very public, very clear message, how did things shift? What was the actual breakthrough idea?
It was kind of amazing, actually. It seems both sides, the Americans and the Emiratis, sort of landed on the same idea around the same time.
Yeah.
This was late June 2020. Avi Berkowitz, Kushner's aide, who was handling a lot of the day-to-day stuff, he'd just come back from Israel realizing the U.S. and Israel weren't really on the same page about annexation details. He gets a call from Otaiba, July 1st. Otaiba basically says, hey, what about this? Normalization, full diplomatic relations, in exchange for Israel dropping the annexation plan.
Wow. And Berkowitz?
Berkowitz apparently replied something like, you won't believe this, but I was thinking almost the exact same thing. That moment of, synchronicity really kicked things into high gear.
So intense diplomacy starts.
Totally. The next few weeks in Washington were just a blur of meetings. Berkowitz shuttling between Dermer, the Israeli ambassador, and Otaiba. Something like 30 meetings, they said. Kushner and Berkowitz made a call. Forget annexation for now. It's a dead end. Let's put everything into pushing for normalization. A major pivot.
Makes sense. But surely there were still big hurdles. I mean, for the UAE, being the first Gulf state to do this, facing potential backlash, what were MBZ's main worries?
Oh, yeah. MBZ definitely had concerns. He was worried about opposition at home, about being seen as the first Arab leader to, quote, throw the Palestinians under the bus. who was a big political risk.
So how did they overcome that? Who reassured him?
Yossi Cohen, the Mossad chief, was really important here again. He kept pointing back to how smoothly the COVID cooperation had gone, that quiet trust building. He assured MBZ of strong U.S. backing, getting Secretary of State Pompeo involved to underline that, and he also played the timing card. Trump might not get reelected. This window of opportunity might close.
Good MBZ's response.
He apparently told Cohen, look, the UAE's ready. We can move fast on opening up government ties, business, tourism, everything. So there was this process of mutual reassurance. Kushner even mentioned being worried the UAE might back out, but people like MBS, the Saudi crown prince, kind of laughed it off, signaling broader, quiet regional support.
So it all came together in August 2020. The reassurances, Cohen maybe offering some extra sweeteners, cyber, technology, or defense gifts was the phrase used, and Netanyahu and Dermer agreed to put annexation on hold.
Exactly. And then there's the whole F-35 fighter jet issue. The U.S. was planning to sell these advanced jets to the UAE, technically separate from the normalization deal.
But connect.
Well, Cohen seems to have subtly indicated that if normalization went through, Israel wouldn't stand in the way of the F-35 sale. So another incentive in the mix. And bottom line, the annexation plan never even got presented to the Israeli cabinet. It was off the table.
Which leads us right to the accords being announced and signed. And there's a funny story about the name itself, isn't there? Abraham Accords.
Yeah, apparently it was quite last minute. Miguel Correa, a U.S. general on the National Security Council, literally came up with it on the morning of August 13th, 2020, just hours before the big announcement.
Why Abraham?
Because Abraham is a revered figure in Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. So it symbolized that shared heritage. And they deliberately used accords plural, hoping other nations would join.
Nice touch. And apparently Correa had a personal connection to MBZ from years before, something about a rescue mission.
That's right. He'd helped organize a mission in Yemen that rescued MBZ's son-in-law. These personal ties, they often play these unseen roles in diplomacy.
So the name was set, but getting the actual wording of the announcement right was tough.
Oh, yeah. Apparently, 130 different versions of the joint statement went back and forth. The real sticking point was how exactly to phrase Israel's agreement not to annex.
How did they finally word it?
The final text said Israel would suspend declaring sovereignty over those West Bank areas and instead focus its efforts now on expanding ties with other countries in the Arab and Muslim world. Suspension, not cancellation, but enough to seal the deal.
And the scope of the agreements was huge, right? Not just diplomatic ties.
Really broad. Investment, tourism, direct flights, security cooperation, telecoms, tech, energy, healthcare, culture, environment, setting up embassies, the whole works.
Okay, so UAE is done. Then Bahrain follows really quickly. How did that happen so fast?
Well, Cohen and Mossad had been working on Bahrain for years, too. They had decades of covert ties. In fact, Israel had apparently run a secret diplomatic mission in Bahrain since 2009, disguised as a company called the Center for International Development.
Wow, basically a secret embassy.
Pretty much. As one Israeli official joked, when normalization happened, all we had to do was change the sign on the door. The groundwork was already there.
Now, Sudan. That came a bit later, October 2020. You said this one was maybe even more significant in some ways.
Yeah, arguably it was. Sudan's history was just so different. They'd actually fought wars against Israel. They'd been close to Iran. Weapons were smuggled through Sudan to Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza. So for Sudan to normalize, that was a profound shift.
It's got a lot in return, didn't they?
A huge amount. The U.S. took Sudan off its list of state sponsors of terrorism. That was massive. They settled legal claims for $335 million, and then the debt released something like $50 billion from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and another $14 billion from the Paris Club of Creditor Nations. Just staggering amounts.
But the story behind the Sudan deal sounds incredibly messy. Internal politics, different Israeli groups competing.
Oh, it was wild. Sources talk about an open war between different Israeli intelligence players. You had Cohen and Mossad working their channels. But you also had Ronan Levy and Mir Ben-Shabbat from Israel's National Security Council, the NSC, running their own parallel efforts, talking to different figures in Sudan's complex power structure, people like Salah Ghosh, the former intel chief, even the old dictator Omar al-Bashir before he fell, then General Burhan, the military leader, and this warlord figure, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemeti.
A real free-for-all. And there were intermediaries involved, too?
Yes. Figures like Nick Kaufman, a British-Israeli lawyer, and Najwa Gata Heldam, a Sudanese diplomat with amazing connections. They were apparently crucial in getting letters exchanged between Netanyahu and General Burhan. Kaufman even took this risky solo trip to Khartoum, the capital, and supposedly stuffed a key letter in his trousers to keep it safe.
Sounds like a spy novel. And there was that secret meeting in Uganda.
Right, February 2020. Netanyahu met Burhan in Uganda. But back in Sudan, the civilian prime minister, Abdullah Hamdok, immediately pushed back. It just highlighted the deep divisions within Sudan's transitional government.
And then tragically, the go-between, Najwa Gadaheldam, she died from COVID.
Yes, very sadly. But in a strange twist, her illness actually created an opening. Ronan Levy from the Israeli NSC flew to Sudan trying to get her emergency medicine. And on that trip, Burhan apparently reaffirmed his commitment to normalization, even with Hamdok objecting. He supposedly told Levy, "I am with you to the death." Strong words.
It's complex motivations, internal rivalries, even a bit of good cop, bad cop between the Israeli players over how much U.S. aid Sudan could expect.
Exactly. It shows just how many different angles and pressures were involved in getting that deal done.
Okay, and then finally Morocco in December 2020. That one felt a bit different again, didn't it? Less about Iran.
Yeah, Morocco was distinct. They already had quite long-standing, albeit informal, ties with Israel. Intelligence cooperation went back years. The big driver for the Morocco deal wasn't really Iran. It was the U.S. agreeing to recognize Moroccan sovereignty over the disputed Western Sahara region.
So a different kind of quid pro quo.
Precisely. It shows these weren't all cookie-cutter deals. Each had its own specific context and incentives.
So after tracing all these threads, the pandemic diplomacy, the annexation fight, the secret channels, the competing players, we get to the big question. Who actually deserves the credit for all this? Jason Greenblatt, one of the U.S. negotiators, compared it to a Rubik's Cube, right?
Yeah. He said you can't solve it until you twist all the pieces into the right order. It suggests, and I think rightly, that it wasn't just one thing or one person. It really did have many fathers, as they say.
So what are the different perspectives on that? How did Washington see it?
From the U.S. side, especially the Trump team, they often point to that Otaiba op-ed as the big inflection point. That's when the possibility of trading annexation for normalization really came into focus. And then they credit U.S. brokerage Kushner, Berkowitz, Pompeo for relentlessly working the phones, managing anxieties, arranging the benefits like the F-35s, and crucially, pushing back against annexation without getting something major in return. Kushner, particularly, was seen as the key day-to-day driver from the American end.
Makes sense. What about the Israeli view, particularly Cohen and Mossad?
Well, Cohen has argued pretty strongly that none of it would have happened without Saudi Arabia's quiet blessing. And that blessing, he says, was built on years and years of Mossad contacts, especially with MBS, the Saudi crown prince. Cohen's fluency in Arabic, his understanding of the culture, he believes allowed him to build a unique level of trust.
So the Mossad view is more about the long game.
Yeah. Exactly. Decades of below-the-radar work, strengthening ties underneath the surface, building that high level of trust before any politicians came in for the signing ceremony. Cohen basically said, you only sign at the climax when you have built a foundation below. They see themselves as laying those deep foundations.
Which fits with what another Israeli diplomat said, peace with the Gulf was built layer on layer, no one single person built it.
Perfectly put. And then you even have Ehud Olmert, who was prime minister before Netanyahu, weighing in. He argues the groundwork started way back maybe 15 years earlier with secret business ties that, in his words, showed them the beautiful face of Israel.
He even shared an email.
Yeah, an email from a former top Mossad official who had been Olmert's envoy to the UAE back then. The official basically said, look, real peace started ages ago. And cheekily added he was happy about the agreement, just less so that Bibi Netanyahu was celebrating as his own achievement. Shows a long history and maybe some internal rivalries, too.
So when you take that step back, the historical weight is undeniable, isn't it? Israel forging open relations with these Arab states, finding common ground, particularly against Iran, it really did shift the regional balance.
Absolutely. It made Israel, as someone put it, ever more a normal part of the picture, a partner, potentially, rather than just the adversary. You think back to someone like Anwar Sadat of Egypt being assassinated decades ago, partly for making peace with Israel. This felt like a different era.
But it's not all smooth sailing, is it? You mentioned Sudan earlier.
Right. That deal, while symbolically huge, has struggled the most. The political situation in Sudan has been incredibly volatile. The military coup in October 2021 made General Burhan a bit of a pariah internationally. The U.S. condemned the coup. But interestingly, Mossad seemed to be keeping lines open quietly, waiting for things to stabilize. You saw Israel's Foreign Minister Eli Cohen visit Khartoum as recently as February 2023. So the follow-through faces real challenges.
So wrapping this all up, it's just an incredible convergence, isn't it? A global pandemic, regional power plays, domestic politics in Israel, decades of spycraft and secret diplomacy all swirling together to create these truly groundbreaking agreements.
It really is. And underscores that this wasn't just, leaders signing papers. It was built on years of often invisible effort.
Yeah.
Building trust in some very unexpected ways and places, from covert meetings to, yes, even a spy chief's living room during lockdown.
Which leaves us and you with something to think about, maybe. If all these seemingly disconnected things, a health crisis, an election promise, secret intel ops, long-term quiet diplomacy, could weave together to fundamentally reshape a region, what other really profound connections, maybe just as hidden, might be shaping